Under a cold morning sky in Linden, California, investigators stood in silence as a shallow grave was uncovered between the vineyard rows. The plastic-wrapped body inside carried a single clue, a wedding ring that had never been removed. This was not just another body. This was Larry McNabney, one of Nevada's most prominent attorneys. To uncover the truth, detectives would have to unmask a predator hiding in plain sight. Part 1. The Grave in the Vineyard. Under the pale light of an early morning in Linden, California, the ground was disturbed. Investigators stood silently around a narrow pit dug between rows of withered grapevines. The scent of damp soil mixed with something far heavier, something that carried the unmistakable weight of death. As the earth was removed, layer by layer, a plastic-wrapped figure emerged. Inside that crude shroud was a man who had once commanded courtrooms, a man whose name had once carried power in Nevada. The scene was eerily quiet. Detectives examined every inch of the burial site. The body bore no immediate signs of violence visible to the naked eye, but its concealment told a story of fear and calculation. The pit was shallow, hurriedly dug, suggesting someone desperate enough to hide the evidence but confident enough to believe it might never be found. One investigator muttered under his breath, almost to himself, that whoever buried this man did not merely want him dead, they wanted him erased. As forensic technicians lifted the body from the grave, the crime scene photographer's flash reflected off a gold wedding band that still clung to the corpse's hand. That single detail cut through the silence like a blade. The image was not one of a random victim. It was personal. This was a man who belonged to someone, a man whose disappearance had once been noticed and questioned. Authorities moved quickly to secure the site. The soil samples were collected, and the path of tire tracks nearby was documented before the wind could sweep them away. Every fragment of evidence was treated as a key that could unlock the mystery of how this body had ended up beneath the cold vineyard earth. As the coroner prepared to transport the remains, a detective finally voiced what everyone at the scene had been thinking, but had not dared to say aloud. This was not merely another missing person found too late. The victim had a name, and that name would soon send shockwaves far beyond the grape fields of Linden. The dead man was Larry McNabney, one of Nevada's most prominent attorneys. The revelation was not just a turning point for the investigation, it was the moment the case transformed from a routine recovery into one of the most disturbing criminal inquiries the state had ever seen. And yet, the question that hung in the air was far darker than the discovery itself. Who could bury a man of such influence in such a crude, lonely grave, and why had they believed they would never be caught? Investigators would soon learn that the answer was far more complex than anyone standing in that vineyard could have imagined. And with that, the real story was only beginning. Part 2. The Illusion of Love. Before Larry McNabney was a name whispered in homicide files, he was the embodiment of success in Las Vegas. Colleagues described him as brilliant in court, a man with a commanding presence who could dismantle an opposing argument with surgical precision. He thrived under pressure, and for years, his reputation only grew. But behind the victories and accolades, Larry carried a weakness few recognized, an unshakable desire for connection and the quiet fear of being alone. It was this vulnerability that Elizabeth, who later would be revealed as Lauren Horwood, saw and exploited with unsettling precision. She first appeared in Larry's life not as a threat but as an answer. When she walked into his law office, she was poised, charismatic, and disarmingly attentive. To Larry, she was not merely a secretary. She seemed like the kind of person who could understand him in a way few ever had. According to investigators who later pieced together the timeline, Elizabeth's approach was calculated from the beginning. She listened more than she spoke, mirroring Larry's words, reflecting his frustrations, and offering comfort disguised as loyalty. In the early days, she was indispensable, managing clients, smoothing out the office chaos, and presenting herself as the perfect partner in both business and life. For a man like Larry, who had spent his life fighting battles in courtrooms, Elizabeth's quiet admiration felt like refuge. Yet, as detectives later concluded, it was during these moments of trust building that the trap was set. Experts in behavioral analysis noted that Elizabeth displayed patterns consistent with manipulative conditioning, gradually isolating Larry from longtime colleagues, subtly inserting herself into his personal financial matters, and reinforcing the idea that only she truly understood him. Over time, this influence deepened. Larry's once flourishing independence began to erode. Those who had known him for years noticed he was drinking more and calling them less. When questioned, Elizabeth would intercept with casual explanations, masking her control under the guise of concern. In hindsight, investigators would later call it emotional enclosure, a process in which the victim's world becomes smaller until the manipulator stands at its center. Then came the first undeniable crack in Larry's professional armor. An internal audit revealed that more than $70,000 had vanished from a client trust account. For a man who had built his career on credibility, it was a devastating blow. Yet Larry didn't confront Elizabeth, at least not publicly. Instead, he shouldered the consequences himself. Soon after, the Nevada State Bar suspended his license. What baffled investigators later was not only the financial loss, but Larry's silence. Why would a man of his intellect protect someone who appeared, even then, to be at the heart of his undoing? Forensic psychologists involved in the case suggested a disturbing but familiar answer. Once trust is weaponized by a skilled manipulator, the victim's sense of reality often bends around the illusion they have been fed. It was the beginning of a downward spiral, and while Larry still believed he was in control, the investigation would eventually uncover that every step was moving him closer to the edge, a descent that neither he nor anyone around him seemed to recognize until it was far too late. The next discovery would not only confirm the depth of Elizabeth's influence, but also revealed just how deliberate her deception had been. Part 3. Seeds of Betrayal. Jennifer Mason had only been working in Larry McNabney's law office for a few weeks when she began to sense that something was wrong. At first, it was subtle, an unanswered phone call here, an uncharacteristic absence from Larry there, but the pattern grew impossible to ignore. Larry, once known for his sharp focus and tireless energy, now seemed distant, almost dulled. He arrived late, his movements sluggish, his voice uneven. Detectives would later note Jennifer's observations as a turning point. She was not just an employee, she was a witness to the slow dismantling of a man's life from the inside. According to her later statements, Elizabeth controlled nearly every aspect of the office. She managed the books, intercepted calls, and even limited Larry's interactions with his oldest clients. It was as if the charismatic lawyer, who had once dominated courtrooms, was becoming a shadow under his own roof. Jennifer described the tension in the office as suffocating. Elizabeth, poised and meticulous, kept a careful watch over Larry's behavior while surrounding herself with Sarah Dutra, a young woman whose loyalty to Elizabeth appeared absolute. Together, they formed an impenetrable barrier around Larry, leaving Jennifer feeling like an outsider in the very place she were. When Larry's health declined further, Jennifer's unease hardened into suspicion. She noticed how he stumbled when walking, how his speech sometimes slurred, as though he had been drinking, even during office hours. Yet the smell of alcohol was never present. Something else was happening, something Jennifer could not explain. Investigators, piecing together the timeline years later, would point to this period as the moment when Larry was most vulnerable. Behavioral analysts concluded that Larry was not only isolated emotionally, but was also being physically subdued, his dependence on Elizabeth deepening with every passing day. Jennifer, however, was the first to see the fracture in what Elizabeth had constructed. Her instincts sharpened after she overheard a conversation late one evening. Elizabeth and Sarah spoke in hushed tones behind the closed door of Larry's private office. Jennifer couldn't make out every word, but one phrase stood out, a term she didn't understand at the time but would later prove critical: the horse tranquilizer. That single phrase, when repeated to investigators months later, shifted the trajectory of the case. Detectives immediately linked it to Xylazine, a powerful sedative used on horses. To hear it mentioned in Larry McNabney's office was more than a red flag, it was a siren. Jennifer didn't yet know the gravity of what she had stumbled upon, but she documented what she could, keeping mental notes of every strange interaction and unexplained absence. In the quiet of that office, Surrounded by case files and silent tension, she had unknowingly become the first thread in unraveling Elizabeth's web of deception. When investigators finally uncovered a recorded conversation, one in which Sarah's voice referenced the drug directly, it would confirm Jennifer's worst fears. And from that moment forward, what had begun as quiet suspicion would explode into undeniable evidence. The stage was set, and the investigation was about to expose just how far Elizabeth's control truly reached. Part 4. The Devil Unmasked. The discovery of the recording mentioning horse tranquilizers gave investigators their first undeniable lead, but it was only the beginning. As they dug deeper into Elizabeth McNabney's past, what they found was not merely a history of deception, it was an entirely fabricated identity. Her real name was Lauren Horwood, born in Florida in 1967, raised in a seemingly ordinary family that concealed extraordinary dysfunction. Public records showed that Lauren was intelligent, academically gifted, and socially magnetic. But as investigators traced her history, they unearthed a criminal record that stretched back over a decade. Fraud, forgery, identity theft, a string of financial schemes that painted the portrait of a woman who had lived by manipulation, moving from one alias to the next as easily as changing clothes. Forensic psychologists brought into the case described Lauren as a textbook example of antisocial personality disorder. She exhibited a calculated charm, a talent for reading people's weaknesses, and an absence of remorse that made her especially dangerous. According to one behavioral analyst, Lauren didn't just deceive, she built worlds around her lies and forced everyone else to live inside them. Her past revealed patterns that mirrored her relationship with Larry. Each of her prior victims, often men with financial stability and social influence, had been methodically isolated and exploited until their lives collapsed around them. Larry, investigators concluded, was not her first target. He was simply her most successful conquest. The psychological profile assembled by the FBI painted a chilling picture. Lauren's high intelligence allowed her to anticipate how others would react, while her lack of empathy freed her from the burden of guilt. She could feign affection with precision, using trust as a weapon and intimacy as leverage. In many ways, her control over Larry was not a spontaneous betrayal, but the inevitable result of a predator's design. Armed with this knowledge, law enforcement prepared for a coordinated arrest. Surveillance teams tracked Lauren's movements, mapping her routines with surgical precision. Officers were briefed on her history of flight, and a warrant was secured to bring her into custody. But before the operation could be executed, Lauren vanished. The home she shared with Sarah was abandoned overnight. Credit card records went dark. Witnesses recalled seeing a red Jaguar Larry's car speeding out of town, but by the time investigators followed the lead, it was too late. Lauren had slipped through their fingers with the same ease she had evaded accountability her entire life. For the detectives working the case, her disappearance was more than a logistical failure. It was proof of just how dangerous she really was. A woman capable of living under 38 different aliases did not simply run. She disappeared into a world she had already mastered. As one investigator later said, "You weren't chasing Lauren Horwood, you were chasing a ghost." But the hunt was far from over, and soon, a discovery in a quiet vineyard would push this case into its most decisive chapter yet. Part 5. The Final Judgment. The vineyard in Linden became the scene where the investigation finally converged. When Larry McNabney's remains were exhumed, the evidence confirmed what detectives had long suspected. Traces of Xylazine were identified in toxicology reports, establishing that Larry had been incapacitated by a sedative never intended for human use. This was not an impulsive act. It was premeditated and calculated with precision. With this confirmation, authorities intensified their pursuit of Lauren Horwood, the woman who had lived for years under the identity of Elizabeth McNabney. Surveillance teams traced her through a trail of forged documents, abandoned addresses, and financial records tied to stolen identities. Each step revealed the same behavioral pattern: manipulation, exploitation, and flight. Lauren's eventual capture in Florida was the result of coordinated pressure from law enforcement and a moment of vulnerability. Her daughter, who had been living with her during her time on the run, reached out to authorities after expressing fear of continuing their fugitive life. Detectives used this opening to close in on Lauren's location, surrounding the modest property where she had been hiding. When she was brought into custody, investigators observed no signs of panic or remorse. Her demeanor was controlled, even detached. Forensic psychologists later described this as consistent with a personality marked by high cognitive function and emotional detachment, traits that had allowed her to deceive and manipulate with efficiency. In custody, Lauren admitted her role in Larry's death. She described the administration of the sedative and the concealment of his body with clinical detail, devoid of emotional expression. This absence of affect reinforced the profile that had been built around her, a manipulator driven not by impulse but by the absence of conscience. Before she could be brought to trial, Lauren hanged herself in her jail cell using strips of fabric torn from her bedding. Her death prevented the formal adjudication of her crimes, but the evidence left behind was sufficient to close the case. Sarah Dutra, her accomplice, faced trial and was convicted of voluntary manslaughter, serving a reduced sentence. The case of Larry McNabney forced legal and psychological experts to confront the intersection between manipulation, criminal behavior, and systemic vulnerabilities. It demonstrated how a skilled offender could exploit personal relationships, bypass professional safeguards, and weaponize trust against their victims. Larry's death was not only a personal tragedy, it exposed how social and legal systems often underestimate offenders who rely on psychological control rather than physical force. It also raised critical questions about the oversight of repeat offenders who use identity fraud to evade detection for years. Lauren Horwood's actions provided a clear example of predatory behavior structured around calculated dependency and emotional dominance. The absence of immediate violence masked the threat until it was too late. As the file on Larry McNabney's murder was closed, one question lingered for investigators and analysts alike. Was this case an isolated act of extreme deception, or the first chapter in a broader category of crimes that society has yet to fully recognize?